Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. I'm Lloyd Anderson, President of City Club. Welcome to our program. Today we focus on the subject of urban planning and the effect that sound planning can give on a city like Portland. Our guest speakers today are John Fregonese, Principal with Fregonese and Calthorpe, and Larry Beasley, Co-Director of Planning for the City of Vancouver, British Columbia. Please note a copy of a report to the Mayor by the Advisory Committee on Long-Range Planning, chaired by David Knowles, and I believe a copy of that is on everyone's table. This is our last program for this season. A short summer hiatus for the month of August. Join us in September for our fall series. In the meantime, watch your bulletin for information and registration for a new fall chef series and to get your new membership directory. Our board host today is seated at the head table, Andy Linehan, member of the Board of Governors and Senior Environmental Planner with CH2M Hill. He will ask the first question of our speakers. Following Andy's question, we will open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please identify yourself as a member and ask your question. No speeches, please. The broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part because of corporate underwriting from CH2M Hill, Weyerhaeuser, Pacific Care of Oregon. We're grateful for their support. On a recent Saturday morning, cyclists gathered in the middle, on an island in the middle of the Mississippi to go on the 4th annual Tour de Sprawl, sponsored by the Sierra Club. They were honoring Minneapolis-St. Paul as one of the top 10 cities in the nation of over 1 million with the worst urban sprawl. A leader of keeping us out of the top 10 has been John Fregonese. John was Director of Growth Management Services for Metro here in Portland before setting up his own partnership in 1997. The job involved analyzing complex technical information, extensive citizen involvement, and adoption by the Metro Council. A first-order accomplishment. Prior to his work with Metro, John headed planning programs in Ashland and Woodburn. The Growth Management and Environment Committee of City Club sponsored a trip to Vancouver, British Columbia, and along with members of the Density Research Committee, visited Vancouver earlier this year. The visit was generously hosted by Councilman Gordon Price and Larry Beasley, our second speaker. Larry is Director of Current Planning and Co-Director of Planning for the City of Vancouver. He headed the development of the new downtown plan, leads planning of the harbor front, South Peninsula, and Falls Creek area, and handles major rezoning and large development applications for the city. I don't know what he does in his spare time. Larry has received numerous awards locally in Canada and internationally for his planning efforts. His academic career includes the University of Arizona, Nevada, Simon Fraser, and the University of British Columbia. Gentlemen, what does the future look like? John.
Thank you, Lloyd. And thanks again to City Club for inviting me back. The last time I spoke here was in 1994 and I was introducing the 2040 growth concept with Gussie McRobert, then Mayor of Medford, of Gresham. Uh-oh. Gussie will never forgive me for that. And of course, and now I have the great privilege of coming back and the considerable freedom of not being employed by a public agency. So now for the first time I can say what I really want and talk about the future of planning and also reflect a little bit back on the last 5 or 6 years as we've entered it. We had our part at Metro and my work there, but certainly there's been a great effort that's been undergoing in Oregon for about 30 years. And I've had the distinct pleasure and really adventure of being a consultant. We have some of our practice here in Oregon and Washington. But what's really amazed me is who else has called on us with our particular skills that we've developed here in Oregon and elsewhere. But my list of clients are in Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Texas, Georgia, and Honduras. You know, all the really liberal places in the United States. And what's interesting is how much growth management is not a liberal or conservative issue. Really, the places that look to managing their growth are ones that have a sense of community and that have a lot of value in the place that they're at. They really care about the place that they're at. They like it, or they like certain parts of it, and they feel that threatened. And the ones that are particularly threatened are desperate enough to hire somebody from Oregon to come and help them. I have to tell you, though, that being a planner from Portland, Oregon, in the United States is like saying so you're a watchmaker from Switzerland. There's a certain assumption that you know what you're doing. And I think we have not tried to dispel our clients of that. I think that it's something that we should strive to live up to that reputation. Sometimes I think we fail. Oregon's a very different state, and one that I think is full of iconoclasts and different kinds of people. And we're very particular, frankly, odd even, I think, when you look back at us from the rest of the United States, from outside the state. And we have these kind of internal conflicts that lead us, frankly, to some of our greatest moments. One is our love of open spaces and farms, and the fear that many of us have with density. And so I'm going to use that as a vehicle to talk about what I see as the future in planning and the future in planning in Portland. When you look at Oregon, it is a strong culture. And it's one of these unusual things that happens that when you have a strong culture established, a small group of people establish it, and it creates this kind of self-replicating culture. And we have that here. We were established by a group of people who came here to farm. And certainly in the Willamette Valley and even around the state, although 97% of us don't farm anymore, we have very strong feelings about farming and about farmland and forestry and forest land. And you kind of have to think about what came with that. Although we don't farm anymore, we have the culture or some of the value set of someone who has farmed for a living. And it's still resident in our culture. Some very good things come out of that and some odd things. You think about a farm background and what was the drive for a person to come to Oregon and get a farm. It was independence. I think that if you look at the turn of the century or when people were coming here, there was a lot of failures, bank failures, there was a lot of ups and downs in the economy, and it was always an American ideal that if you could own your farm, no matter what happened to the monetary economy, you could provide food and fiber for you and your family, and you could weather a storm. And on good years, you'd have extra, and you could sell some extra, and you could have some money, and you could buy things. But in bad years, you'd eat, you'd be sheltered. So land came with a sense of security. And if you look at the turn of the century, how many of you, I know many of you know McMenamin's pub out in Troutdale, but it was the Multnomah County Poor Farm. And the poor farm was the welfare safety net around the turn of the century. That if you were poor and were unemployed, the best thing they could do is teach you how to farm, because there was always going to be a demand for farm labor. And at least you could feed yourself if you knew how to farm. So you would be housed in the Multnomah County Poor Farm and taught the skills of a farmer. The Depression, of course, changed that idea. taught us that there was something about that was quite wrong, and that insecurity did not, basically knowing how to be a farm laborer didn't guarantee very much. And after we went through the Depression, you had the World War II, which led to a lot of privation and rationing and so forth. Of course, after World War II, we came to this new era. Most of us became urban. We moved to the cities, we got jobs, we left the farm. And there was this exuberance, you know, during the war, women's fashions even were made with very little cloth, and they had these little tight dresses. And after the war, you had these big flouncy things because all of a sudden we had lots of fabric again. Our cars got big and full of fins and just a lot of exuberance, and a lot of fantasy styles were going around. And at that period of time, we began to build single-family homes on lots at larger numbers than had ever been done before. That certainly was something that we had before, but also before the war, if you look at historic neighborhoods before the war, you had a tremendous array of housing. You had single-family homes on large lots, you had single-family homes on small lots, you had accessory units, you had units off an alley, you had duplexes, you had apartments, you had a whole range of housing, townhouses. You had dozens of kinds of homes that were built all over. After the war, something happened. And I think that the other thing that happened at that wartime is that we had a view of ourselves that was particularly monochrome. We were all white, we were all middle class, we all wanted the same thing. We had a husband that worked, a wife at home, and 2.3 kids. We drove a car, and we all wanted that, right? Isn't that right? Isn't that what we all were? And, you know, we had this view that excluded large parts of society, and we started building our society so that it would fulfill that mythical dream, that single American dream. A friend of mine, Mike Houck, turned 50 last year. I guess I shouldn't tell everyone that. But a friend of his bought him a Life magazine from 1948, the year he was born. And he was flipping through it and found this ad that I thought I would read to you because it's very evident of what the idea was with single-family homes and subdivisions and the whole idea of zoning for exclusively single-family homes. It has a picture of a little fellow here in an Indian outfit attacking an endangered species here, a little frog. And it says, "Give a man some room to roam in." It says, "It took an explosion to get Bill Jr. out into the wide open spaces of the suburbs. Not a literal explosion, but the ones that shows up on the maps of the cities. A few decades ago, our cities and towns were largely concentrated clots in which kids like Bill and their families huddled close to factories or business districts. But men of General Motors and other companies thought they had something in the automobile. They wanted to produce more and sell more." That's understandable. "By dipping deeply into earnings for regular improvements, they succeeded. And as cars grew better and more useful, cities and towns changed. They exploded into the countryside, spreading real estate development, suburbs, and smart new neighborhoods all over the map. And so Bill Jr. is gaily growing up where boys can be boys and the breathing's good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And down at the bottom it says, "Where the people profit when a business prospers." And you know, the thing that you have to realize is that this idea of expansion was something that was considered a great good, and was attacked with a lot of enthusiasm by cities and counties at the time, quite so. And what happened is that this idea of the American dream of owning a home, I think, was tied quite a bit to agriculture. Because if you look at us coming, especially in Oregon, coming from that agricultural background in the United States, moving to the city, and you look at the American single-family home on a quarter-acre lot, you find kind of a vestigial farm. You know, you have a house set in the middle of a large lot, and around that you have basically a crop. And you go out and you plant this crop, and you fertilize it, you water it, you tend it, and then you go out and once a week you harvest it with a tiny combine, and you take your crop and you throw it away, and you start again. And so this symbolic agriculture is pretty evident that is a practice that we like to carry on. Now, that's kind of absurd, you know, but there's a lot of things that are absurd. I'm sure 500 years ago there was a shepherd out, you know, hitting a ball through the sandy moors of Scotland, and all of a sudden there's millions of us chasing balls through sandy moors of golf courses playing golf. That's absurd too. But unlike golf, practicing symbolic agriculture became required by law. Try to build a house in most jurisdictions in the United States without sufficient land to practice symbolic agriculture. You can't do it. You have to buy enough land to have a little farm around you. You have to plant that with the prescribed crop. Otherwise, you'll infect your neighbor's crop. You have to harvest that crop regularly and throw the material away and start again. And when you suggest someone that people should be able to build homes with no yards, you find this kind of furious, almost irrational response that the myths of high density that you hear in public hearings many, that people will, that no one will want to live that way, so why bother building it? That it causes crime, it's degrading and unhealthy. Like normal people that live on a house with a lot, all of a sudden will start gnawing off their arms or something if they move into high density. It just causes this complete decline in the human brain. And it really comes from the vestiges of the 50s, one of the only things that's really left in our society where we saw us as monochrome, as having a single American dream. What happened in Oregon, very different from the rest of the United States, is that we had a love of real farms. And that love of real farms led us to this confrontation. We realized, first of all, we drew lines around our cities to keep the cancer of the city from spreading into the pure and beautiful farmland. Cities, after all, in Oregon, urban, like most of the United States, we don't view cities as a very friendly and warm place. At least we haven't until recently. And so for 30 years, we've been working to preserve farmland. And by drawing that ring around our cities, we started to have to look inside our cities and worry about, became a choice whether you sprawled or not. You know, most of the United States, sprawl happens, people complain about it, it's like the weather. In Oregon, you have to choose to sprawl. And in fact, that empowering decision is what makes us quite a bit different, has made a radically different landscape than what you see in the rest of the country. And what happened is that this realization, this line, made us come to this Hobson's choice that we had, that if some of us could be convinced to give up symbolic agriculture and live on homes without yards, that we would be better off with the farms. And in fact, that is the basis of a lot of the public policy debate that's come about in Oregon over the last decade. Who's going to volunteer? And where will we allow this? Where will we permit people to do this? And I remember the fight in 1994. Certainly, some opponents were shocked that we would even suggest such a thing. Of course, that it was a savage idea, and that people would always want a yard, that everyone wants low density. These things that came from the 50s were really, and many people still believe, as if lower, and that it will never work, and that it was social engineering to allow townhouses to be built, as if single-family zoning wasn't the biggest social engineering project ever undertaken in the United States. And what happened is some brave cities, Portland leading the way, frankly, and Ashland, I have to say, my old town, but Portland really, being very brave, allowed some property to be developed as homes without yards. And what we found was there was a waiting list of people waiting to say, I want to be free of symbolic agriculture. I'm tired of tilling the soil. I want to be free, and I'm ready to move to the city, and I like it. And what happened is over the last 5 years, you know, many of these projects have been tremendously successful. You know, when I used to watch these things when I was working for Metro, I knew that for example, there was almost no relationship between lot size and home price in Portland. If you account for the size of the house, there was no relationship. I mean, houses with big lots aren't any more expensive than houses with small lots because there's not really a lot of demand for that. But houses with lots under 2,500 square feet had a premium. There was pent-up demand for that. Townhouses and condos spent half the time on market of regular homes. I mean, you can see that there's a lot more people that are ready and willing to do that than we first thought. And the other thing is, no one was being forced into high density. You know, didn't see these scenes of these broken people being led in chains by jackbooted planners down to live in the townhouses, locked in them, you know, never to come out. You know, people took their life savings, go down and get a mortgage that's not as easy to get for a single-family home, trying to get into a mixed-use development, trying to get into a townhouse. They certainly have done very well. Aranco, I know that there's been, which is out in Hillsborough, outsells its neighbors. There's been a recent study that shows a lot of these traditional neighborhood developments that are higher density outsell the standard product in their area. So Portland is a place where, reluctantly perhaps, we allow people to choose to make their own American dream. One of the hundreds of American dreams you can have now is at some point in your life you can live in the suburbs on a big lot. I do. And at some point in life you can come back in and live, and I want to, come back in and live free from symbolic agriculture. And the big problem now is that our planning system really is set up, and even Portland's planning system was set up around regulations that prohibit uses and enforce symbolic agriculture. I mean, that's the bottom line of a lot of these things. And we really have very little in the way of models to use to move out of that. And I think that we've been doing some focus work down in Marion County, and I found really something that I've come to believe over the last 25 years in planning is really true of Oregonians. They are willing to let other people choose to live the way they want. By and large, when you ask people, should people be able to live in townhouses or houses with small lots if that's what they want? You know, 75% say yes, of course. Now, there's still that 20% that I know sometimes occupy a whole room that comes and says, I don't care what you think, you should never be able to live in a house with a small lot, even if that's what you want. But most people are willing to give people a choice. But they expect something for it. Portland has liberalized its zoning code, allows more uses and more mixture of uses than almost any other city in the United States. There are things that are legal in Portland that you would never be able to do in the bastions of liberalism like Dallas, Atlanta, or Salt Lake City. They would never consider what is routine in Portland. But what you have to do is the public expects some quality out of that. They expect compatibility with their neighborhoods, and they expect quality. There's four things that they really want. First of all, first of all, they want choice. I think some of the proponents have really been amiss in asking people, in saying, we have to learn to change our way of living. You know, there's plenty of volunteers. Don't try to talk other people into it. Just make the choice available. Secondly, open space near high density. One of the consistent things that we hear, people hate high density when it's all crammed together, when there's no parks, there's no greenery. Just because we're moving from the farm into the city, just because we're giving up symbolic agriculture, doesn't mean we've lost our love of nature. That nature has to be close by, and it has to be something you can see and touch and smell during the day. That's, if you look at Northwest Portland, I mean, right there with Forest Park, that's kind of an ideal. Certainly even downtown, the park blocks. The third is design. These factory boxes called these kind of factory-built apartments where they take one design and extrude it several hundred times over a complex, put a wall around it. They're horrible. And I think that kind of design turns people against all kinds of high density because they think that's what you mean. And when you ask people about density and they don't like it, that's the image that they bring up, those factory-built apartment complexes. Design to make this human scale, to have some diversity, to make it fit into a neighborhood is really essential. And fourth is natural areas. Let me quote from a focus group. This gentleman said, look, I'm willing to really allow higher density. He was actually telling the other people in his focus group how good it could be. But he said, wildlife areas, streams, trees, and parks, that's what Oregon's about. We need lots of that. In the city limits, close to where people live. Tearing up hills, building houses where they slide down and get flooded, that's just plain dumb. It's like we never learn. And that's so unnecessary. It's something that I know that we can do both things quite well. So as Portland looks at choosing a new leader and going a new direction with its planning bureau, I'm quite happy because planning in many places, and Portland has suffered from this, is over-regulatory. The point of planning is not to build a better zoning code, it's to provide a better city, a better place for people to live. And in a sense, I think the Portland Planning Bureau was ready to have a new focus for it. And the focus ought to be building livable communities, basically being able to pull together all the pieces that make a livable community without regard to bureau lines. One of the great challenges of any kind of governance in Portland is to be able to look at design, and regulations are part of it, but streets and parks and the whole package that goes together, because that's what people want. The new person, I think you've got to have a thick skin but you also have to be empathetic and listen, because people that are angry and exhibit real fear, and planning does make people really afraid sometimes, they also give you good ideas. And you have to be able to listen and to be able to be out there and enjoy talking to people even when they might be angry at her. And finally, I think the important part is to be passionate, consumed and driven to make Portland planning worthy of the great city that it is. Thank you.
That was perfect for what I want to talk about. Just perfect. Thank you, Lloyd and John. I'm absolutely thrilled to be in Portland. I did meet a lot of people in Portland from Portland the first time when they came to Vancouver, and I thought, boy, these are nice people, and I was thrilled to then have a chance to get to know some of them and know some of you and talk about an issue which is really important to me. And if you're interested in farmland, then real farmland, then the issue I'm going to talk about is probably really important to you as well. I'm going to tell you a story about housing. I'm going to tell you a story about high density housing. It's a story about housing first. It's a story about housing of all kinds. It's a story about housing everywhere. And pretty quickly, you're going to see that it's also a story about neighborhoods and about community. And ultimately, what it turns into is a story about lifestyle. Lifestyle, because that's what is at the heart of what John is talking about and what I'm going to be talking about. And the moral of the story is a really, really simple one. People in residence of all kinds, and as many as possible, and as comfortably as possible, people in residence are really the salvation of the city in the future. And we've got now about 25 years of not having that in our inner cities to prove my point in almost every North American city. I hope the technology is going to work here. This story is going to explain to you Vancouver. And I'm going to use the experience of my hometown to illustrate my point. And this story is important to Portland. The fact is that our two cities, though not quite the same size, are actually very much alike. We both sell our towns as a great place to live, and therefore as a great place to visit, to work, and to invest. And so for both of us, what I'm going to talk about is really a part of an economic development theme. It's not just a question of lifestyle and of aesthetics, but it's about economic development. And as we approach the 21st century, housing and talking about it is a pretty smart economic development discussion. Now, to give you the comparison, I'm going to assume that you know a few things about Vancouver, British Columbia. You'll know that in our region we're about 2 million strong. You'll probably know that we're a town of immigrants. And so we're ethnically and culturally very, very diverse, much more so than what I've seen so far in Portland. You'll know about our very magnificent natural setting of mountains and water. And of course, I guess as much as anything, you'll know we're Canadian. And because we're Canadian, we come from a very different culture, and we have a very different personality than you, our American cousins. And so I tell my story with a great deal of humility that only some of it may be relevant and may be useful to you. For example, a small fact, half of us in Canada live in apartments already. Half of the people in the country are not living anymore in single-family homes, and that's just an illustration of that. Now, the scene of my story is downtown Vancouver, that wonderful peninsula with Stanley Park at the tip, surrounded by water, where over the last 15 years, an experiment of vast proportions has been underway. The downtown resident population has grown by almost 20,000 people since the late 1980s. And the downtown population now, in the area you see right there, stands at about 60,000 people. And it continues to grow leaps and bounds. We're as busy as could be at City Hall to deal with that growth. Our growth goals are very, very simple. And they were expressed for the first time in a central area plan that we adopted about a decade ago. In essence, our plan is to engender housing and to create a balance of that housing with commerce, with the right mix of retail and entertainment, and then focusing a lot on the street and making the street the focal point of public life. And that brings me back to the storyline of housing. For the inner city, we're after diversity and we're after intensity. We're after a lot of housing. And this spontaneously, we believe, creates vitality. It puts more people closer to each other and closer to the destinations that they want to go to. And this slashes travel costs and travel time. And it also makes a very strong move toward environmental sustainability. Because one thing we believe is that every time a human being occupies a piece of land, they tend to defile the piece of land. So if you can keep them off, you have a higher chance of dealing well with the natural environment. But we're also after diversity and choice. Diversity in the type of housing, apartments in towers and mid-rises, and row houses, a lot of row houses. In fact, in downtown Vancouver, over 600 row houses now under construction and built. And lofts, both in reused buildings, but also in new buildings. And live-work units, and residential hotels, and housing above shops, and even floating homes. The other kind of diversity that we're after is diversity in the kinds of households that people come from. We're looking for condominiums, definitely that. We're looking for market rental. We're looking for SROs for singles and mingles and transient people. We're looking for housing that's suitable for families with children, and 25% of new housing is designed to be suitable for families with children according to some very strict guidelines for child design. We're looking for housing for seniors and those with special needs, especially in what we call cooperatives or co-ops. And of course, we're looking for housing for low-income people. And in our new development, 20% of the units have to be held aside for our poorest people. We work very hard to cluster housing, to cluster it into neighborhoods that are meaningful, because we know that there's a lot more to a lifestyle, to life, than just the place to live. There's a sense and a need to be in a neighborhood. We plan these neighborhoods with all the facilities that people need at their fingertips, whether it's a park, and we make sure that about half the land is rededicated back to parks and open space. Or it's a community police office, or it's a daycare, or it's a community center, or it's a school or a library. Whatever is needed to support a community, we make sure is there. And each developer is required to deliver these facilities to the city standard as the demand emerges, as the population comes into a community, either directly in their projects, such as the renovation of the Roundhouse in the False Creek North area, or through payments, individual payments in lieu, which are invested then as the neighborhood grows. And we found that this was an essential element of our high-density housing strategy for the very simplest of reasons, which is that if we had tried to put the cost of this development and growth on the backs of the existing taxpayers, they would have rebelled, and they would have brought the experiment to an absolute halt immediately. But we also want neighborhoods that have identity and coherence. We either put in place or reinforce an existing local commercial high street. Sociologists often call it the third place, the place after home and work, where people in a neighborhood get together and really invent the culture of the neighborhood. They invent the reason why the neighborhood works and is important to them. We arrange our streets and our commercial districts to create areas of lower ambient noise levels for the residents. We call these areas of tranquility. And then we design the public realm in each area with a different motif for furnishings and paving and landscaping and public art, all simply to emphasize that each neighborhood should be unique, and you should remember it as different from other neighborhoods. Now, the tricky part, the really tricky part, is how to get the urban design right so that when you build these places, they will work. They'll function well, they'll be comfortable, they'll look good, and they'll be humane, or they'll be, as it were, gentle to the soul and to the psyche. We've done many areas, and at this point, hundreds of buildings in the inner city, and I can testify that that designing these is very, very difficult. And partly it's because, as John alluded to, we have very few models to look for out there. There's not a lot of high-density models that you can say, oh, that's what we did, so let's try that. Frankly, we have made some of the same discoveries as the new urbanist architects made. And that is that the traditional relationship between the street and the sidewalk and a building face, and the traditional relationship between buildings is a very good thing. And with a little dose of Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Street and a couple of design sleights of hand, one can, in fact, turn high density into a very workable thing. And in turn, high density can generate a project's economics, enough value to carry quality materials, to generate amenities on site, and to make a very nice contribution to the neighborhood's amenity infrastructure. Well, I could talk all day about this topic because there are hundreds of aspects about it that are important, but I did want to just show you a few of the things that we do, the design moves that we make that we think are important. First is that we do go for very thin towers, very small floor plates, and we try to hide the base of the tower back behind a lower scale building which is nicely scaled to the street, so that the towers almost tend to disappear from your consciousness as you're walking along the street. Living in a rainforest, we do everything we can to provide weather protection, but we don't allow any above or below grade connections. We want everyone to come back to the sidewalk to meet one another and to go to their destinations. We don't tolerate the blank wall. We do not like blank walls. And we force lots of doors and porches and stoops and all kinds of things in order to avoid the blank wall. And you can see some of that. We line neighborhood sidewalks with trees and with grassed boulevards. And wherever possible, we put a double row of trees so that it provides a nice canopy to the sidewalk. And this immediately greens the whole area, and it immediately tames the harshness that's inevitable in concrete and brick and all of those materials. We really enjoy our street walls. We avoid useless plazas. We minimize vehicular crossings of sidewalks. We ban individual garage doors from the streetscape. And we even keep porte-cocheres as a minimum as possible. We put as often as possible, we put the parking underground and out of the way. And if you do see a parking lot in downtown Vancouver, it's temporary. It's not ever permanently approved, and there's not very many of them. We manage our views like they were gold, and we manage our shadows like they are pariahs. And we spend a lot of time and effort and computer modeling in order to make sure that we keep as many of the views open as possible, and as we keep all the open spaces as sunny as possible. And my favorite thing is that we create these wonderful private courtyards, places where people can get away from the hustle and bustle of the street and the activity of the city, and in a sense escape to their own private garden. This is probably the only vestigial aspect left of that agriculture that John was talking about. But it creates nice little escapes. Now, I have to stop here because I could continue to tell you more and more of these things that we do, and there's a lot more of them. But you can see by this that what you can do is design high density so that it has very low negative effects. And really, that's what you have to do. And the magic of doing this is both in the detail and in the basic arrangement of the place. And you have to be paying attention to both of those. And that brings me to a little segue about why high density tends to happen. I had some visitors from the United States in Vancouver just last week, and they were telling me, kind of wagging their hands at me and saying, you know, Vancouver is a really tough place to get in and out of. It is really, really hard to move around in your city. And of course, because they were tied to their car, I had to admit they were right. It is pretty hard. Most American visitors, in fact, find our streets are very narrow. They find that our traffic controls are rudimentary, 19th century even, and they find that our parking is completely confusing, even mysterious. They find also that having their car in the city can be expensive. If you park at the wrong place, it can be very expensive. If you make one of those moves you take for granted in America, it can be very expensive. But what they don't realize is that that's all done on purpose. As one person put it in Vancouver, congestion is our friend. We believe that. We don't have freeways in Vancouver. There are no freeways. And that's one of the most popular moves that we ever made in the city. And every time anyone talks about freeways, they don't get elected again. That's basically what happens. We use our arterial street system for an array of movements, not just for the car. The car has to, is one thing you'll find in any of these public areas. We have bottlenecks at our bridges, and we don't build many more bridges. And in fact, when we start talking about that, it gets very controversial and we back off, and it costs too much money anyway. By policy, and this is where it really gets important, we're holding the capacity of the automobile at current levels. And the effect of that is that a lot more people are coming back to live downtown. They want to be close to work. They want to make their lives a lot more easy. They want to have a lot more times with their families. And the trip is tough, so they're saying, in droves, why don't we find a place downtown, and then we'll have a lot more time, and it will be a lot easier. Now, we're putting a lot of money into transit, various kinds of transits. We're building a full bicycle system, and I've noticed you're doing that here in Portland. We are also threading greenways through each of our neighborhood areas. And these are our responses to the pressures of transportation growth, favoring walking and biking and transit and goods movements and even alternative modes, and then the automobile, in that order. I do want to highlight one project that kind of exemplifies all of this and all that we're up to in this respect, and that's our waterfront bikeway, walkway, and interconnected park system, which we commonly call simply the seawall. We decided about a decade ago that as we reclaimed our waterfronts, and that's where a lot of development has happened, the water's edge would be saved for the public, for public use and public access. And this builds upon the very popular beach system we have right downtown, as well as the Stanley Park Walkway, which was built by one gentleman over an entire lifetime and is one of the great treasures of the city. So we built the walkway system, the seawall system, which will shortly connect for about 25 kilometers. And it does tie everything in the inner city very nicely together. It takes on many, many different forms, generally taking on the character of the area in which it passes. And it is probably the most important and popular public work project that we have ever taken on in the city. I've got to tell you, it is very, very special. It's a thing that people actually come to just to be on it, not even to go anywhere, but just to enjoy it. Now, in a nutshell, what this story has all been about, as I said at the beginning, is lifestyle. If you want residential to work in the city, you have to succeed at that very intuitive level of lifestyle choice. And part of our strategy is pretty obvious. We're trying to create an attractive surrogate for the single-family dwelling in the single-family suburb. And our row houses kind of typify this. If you have kids, or if you have a dog, or if you're afraid of heights, or if you like your own front door, or if you want a private garage, or if you need a basement to store all the junk in, but you still want to live in higher density, then the row houses fit the bill. And many, many families are saying, sounds good to me, and coming back to the city as a result of that. But the other aspect of our strategy really is to facilitate a life experience that is even more exciting and even more convenient and yet equally safe and secure as that offered by the suburbs. So going to the theater, being minutes away from a host of great restaurants and shops, taking an evening stroll, biking to work, connecting with all kinds of people that you don't come in contact with on your day-to-day basis, being surprised, for God's sakes, and closing it all up and heading off for the weekend to somewhere else. That's what we're trying to do in creating an urban lifestyle. And a lot of people are connecting to that. And all kinds of people, whether they be families or seniors or empty nesters or mingles or whatever, singles, young professionals, are choosing that lifestyle. Now you might ask, why is this happening? And how is it happening in Vancouver, besides the fact that we're Canadian? And to start, I have to admit that we're pretty lucky. Circumstances have offered Vancouver many of the right kinds of demographics for the future. We have a buoyant economy. We have massive and wealthy immigration. We do have an inflow of capital, and most of the demographics in terms of people aging and what they're putting their families together and taking their families apart, et cetera, is working in our favor. But I also have to say that we have had aggressive public policy and planning making. We've been drawing out very carefully, a public consensus about what is good in the city. And most of all, we have enjoyed a sustained political mandate supporting our work at the level of our mayor, at the level of our councillors, regardless of political party or background. And that has been sustained for now about 20 years. And it supports the vision strongly that I've been describing. Now, a part of all of that is based on a technique that we've developed with the private sector to design and manage growth. And we call it the cooperative planning model. And all it really is a way for the city staff and politicians, for developers, and for the public to interact positively together and with each other as we all do our individual parts to reinvent the city. Now, I won't go into all the details. It's kind of bureaucratic. It's sort of boring. But I'll tell you a couple of things about it. First is that we're structuring a very highly discretionary regulatory framework. We have a big emphasis on guidelines and incentives and less on hard regulation. A lot of stuff is done by negotiation, but you can see that favors a good idea. It allows it to be tested. In planning, we go from the large scale and conceptual down to the specifics in stages, building the consensus as we go along and taking the decisions as we go along, which then are solid and given to the next most detailed level. We put issues up early and we resolve them early, and then we don't talk about them again. We literally join forces with everyone in the design exercise. Policy is decided by politicians, and so it should be, and development approvals are done by appointed officials. They are not political decisions. And for all practical purposes, and in our country this is really important, in Vancouver our decisions are final. There is very little appeal. So we don't have many lawyers involved. And that in and of itself is a very good idea. Sorry to the lawyers, I hope there's not too many in this room. The result of this process is that even with the grandest urban design gestures, the rezoning process and the planning process never fails. And in fact, in 15 years, it's not once failed yet. Public hearings are happily relatively quiet. And that's what we as planners are after. A quiet public hearing. Not because people are alienated, but because most people tell us that the process before they got there was decently satisfying to them and decently fulfilling for them. Now I know you're thinking to yourself, at just about this moment in this conversation, what about the other side? What about all the problems? And I have to admit that I have been emphasizing the positive to tell my story. I'm also like a visiting fireman, so I get to do that. And I'll admit, like every other city, Vancouver does have its problems. We're struggling with housing everyone adequately and making sure that our low-income folks have a place in the new community that does grow. And that's hard, and I know that's hard here because I've talked to your planning officials about that. We're struggling with the effects of alcohol and drug abuse and all the things that that means in our inner city community. And I must say, I could only dream to enjoy the success that you seem to be enjoying here with your integrated system for dealing with that. And in fact, my public officials have been down here talking to your people about how you've done it. We do have our blighted areas. I could just drool about the money and the good ideas that you've put into the public realm, the way you finish your sidewalks and your streets, because we don't do that in nearly as good of a job. But you know, that doesn't blunt the main point that I want to make today, and that is that we, and I think like you, are trying to build a new and very different kind of contemporary North American city. We're trying to build a city that draws regular folks, middle-class folks, right back to the heart of the city with all the spending power and the innovation and the political know-how that will come with those people. We're trying to build a city that does, in fact, create a place for our most vulnerable citizens and gives them the support they need. We're trying to build an economy around all of these new people that are living in the heart of the city and making that one of the things that drives the whole economy of the city. And we're trying to avoid some of those terrible, awful abuses of the private environment or the natural environment that have been made by cities for the last 100 years. And so I sense is Portland. And that's why I'm here to tell the story about Vancouver, and that's why I was thrilled to tell the story, because I could come here, and by virtue of coming here, I could learn, and that's why I hope that we will forge a bond between our two cities so that we can invent this kind of city together. Thank you very much.
I just have to ask, when you were visiting the city offices this morning, did you happen to pick up a job application? Or could we send you one, please? In the Blueprint 2000 project, Portland's put considerable effort into coordinating the development, review, and application process among the myriad agencies that are involved in the development process in the city of Portland. Work on coordinating the same multiple agencies into a coordinated long-term planning process has lagged behind that somewhat. what lessons can Vancouver offer Portland in terms of coordinating the multiple agencies and cities which are involved in the development process in terms of long-term vision and implementing that vision?
I guess that's for me.
Just for you, you bet.
I think the key thing is to have the same people involved at doing both things. I've noticed some cities, and I think San Diego is one of them, has kind of separated these out so that the regulatory part is being done by one group and the planning part is being done by another group. And I think that's not a good idea because they're both creative people and they'll try to reinvent one another all the time. I think it's better to have the continuity, to have the people like myself who are involved in the initial planning and visioning and dreaming and setting the regulations. Well, I also sit on the development permit board that makes the decision with two other public officials. And so there's that continuity of vision and intent that I think is pretty important. I don't know if that helps, but that's part of it.
Thank you.
John Leeper, City Club member. This is a question for John. John, I've known you for some time over at Metro. This really addresses what I view as a Metro-wide problem, not just the city of Portland. I also have got opinions, it seems in some cases opinions for all occasions. My question to you is, do you think that the communication skills at Metro and local governments are really getting out to the public? What you visualize, and this goes back to '94 and before and on forward from there, as to what 2040 is, and once again, livability, and the fact that much of your plan addresses things over a 20-year span, something I think a lot of individual citizens have difficulty visualizing.
I would say no. In fact, I'm kind of disappointed. In a sense, what 2040 always meant to me was not the numbers and the goals and the densities and so forth, but the vision of main streets and town centers and the vital places that Larry discussed, and the American images that we have of that, the Main Street image, the small town image, and using that as a way to really excite people about the potential to use that to rebuild their areas, to build new areas. And I'm just, this has always been a problem in Oregon, and it certainly has not gotten any better, is that planners in the state tend to plan by numbers, and you get about as good a result as if you paint by numbers. You know, it's a lot more detail and a more intuitive process than a lot of planners want to make it. And I think if they would listen better to what the people on the streets say, what they view as a good thing, and use some of those values in trying to use the various tools that they have to really create a lively neighborhood and a good livability, I think we would all be a lot better off, and the planning profession would be better off. So I would say less focus on numbers and more focus on quality and the more livable, intuitive aspects of planning.
Time for one more question, I'm sorry.
Jim Zarin, City Club member. I would like to ask you both about the public realm. I was hoping here today that I would hear about the importance of parks, public realm, public amenities in making density work, and I think I heard both of you say absolutely it's critical. And I'm concerned, John, I think as you know, a lot of us are concerned that we're not really well equipped in Oregon, in the region and even in the city necessarily to fund it. And I'm curious, again, how you've managed to do it in Vancouver without having only mega projects to get the developers to pay for it, and how well we're really equipped here, both in our strapped public finance system and in our ability to extract fees from developers to really make it happen. And without that public realm investment, aren't we doomed to fail?
You want to go first?
Yeah.
Visiting fireman?
Yeah. A lot of our public realm, first thing is that about half of new development in larger areas is dedicated to parks or other kinds of public uses. So we believe very strongly that you've got to have that public realm, parks, the greenery, not just the respite of it, but also the rejuvenating qualities of it. We have one advantage, which is you can't get too far away from the water in downtown Vancouver, and the water itself is an open space of vast utility and importance. But having said that, the balance of the job is to create a lot of open space on the land. In the last 10 years, for example, we've added about 65 acres of parks just on the downtown peninsula that you were looking at. And the way most of that is done is opportunistically. It's taking advantage of the larger projects, doing the pro formas that help you understand of the vast value that is given with the public decision to give development rights, and negotiating some component of that value to come back to the public. And as long as you can do that when you can do it, but also not do it when the economics don't work, so that you don't stop other development initiatives, then you can get a good public consensus to do it.